Good morning and welcome to the Four Pillars of Self Mastery. This week and next, I'll be going through levers and drivers that we can use in the four pillars to accelerate our own transformation. And I use transformation as a broad term. It could be coming out of a hole, it could be going up to your loftiest dreams, it could be just getting back on track, or it could be you're going through a pivot and getting to the other side of that. It's all similar, but the word transformation is the distinction is that it's not incremental. We are making a major shift, the kind of shift that scares you, the kind of shift that screams threats. And that's why we talk about the nervous system so much, because the fight or flight that happens when a person is frightened by something that's a real threat is the same fight or flight that happens when a person gets bad news and they go into this spiraling state. If that happens, if you ever watch somebody who has a phobia, the mere conversation about the item, whether it's a snake, a spider, heights, or water, you can see them start tightening up. And if you bring in a box and you're talking about a snake, and you'll see they'll start actually acting as though the snake is right there in front of their face. And this is all imaginary. I don't want to say imaginary. This is all from internal. There is no snake. There's a perception that there's a snake, and so the action is happening the same way. Now, most literature, and this backdrop is dynamic leadership. We're not talking about mental health. This is about owners and leaders finding access to new tools and resources for high performance. In that space, what I'm doing is focusing on prevention. So it's almost like emotional intelligence 3.0, because emotional intelligence is great. Everything in there is spot on. The idea of it's more than intelligence that indicates or predicts success 100%. But when emotional intelligence was created or published or established, developed, it was, I want to say 1995. I first started becoming aware of it in early 2000s, but didn't lean in until almost 2008 or 9. The thing with emotional intelligence is almost all on the back end. It's almost all corrective, because at that time the neuroscience wasn't far enough along where the research was out in the public sphere. And so it was still thought that the subconscious is a mind. And because the subconscious is a mind, if you look at emotional intelligence, there's a lot of words or phrases like hardwired, can't change personality, can't change your identity, can't change your intelligence, many statements like that. And the whole picture is about correction after the fact. So when it gets into emotional triggering, which is what we'll be talking about today in part, the conversation is more along the lines of how do you correct it after the emotion has taken force. If you've watched any of my content, you know I talk about you have 90 seconds to modulate that emotion. And to put that in perspective, emotional intelligence talks about regulation. So regulation is the umbrella. Modulation is just one part of that regulation. And in this sense, modulation is about getting that emotion to where it's no longer uncomfortable, to get it back to what I'll call homeostasis. Whereas regulation is the entire thing, which in emotional intelligence, I'm not knocking emotional intelligence. I'm 100% on board with it. Dynamic leadership is making it actionable. It's making it easily accessible, because you don't have to go through all this training and meditating to try to figure out how do I stop my amygdala from doing what it's going to do. Here, we use models and frameworks that we can talk about with a common language. That's why I talk about the 7 performance areas, the 7-step reset, to understand what a stimulus response cycle is all about. The 1-second model to show what happens between stimulus and reaction, not even response, and response is separate. And as we go through that, we get a common language, and we can make this shift. You make this shift initially on a good day of a good week. You'll see results in a month, maybe a month and a half. Where it works reliably, good bad day of a bad week, I'll say it takes 6 months or more, depending on how much you work at it and depending on how often you want to walk through the door. Because remember, the scary thing is that door is scary, but we're shifting it. The doors, you no longer see it as scary. It's now a door, but you still have resistance to opening the door. You've got to go through the door. So we'll make the shifts and you'll make the shifts, but you have to go through the door. And A good example is when a person works on ums. The first thing is awareness. They're aware that they're saying and they come by. I know I'm saying them now, but I can't stop. Well, that's the first step. Then the next step is you start it's inserting a pause instead of the But the point is, they have to take that next step. Awareness that they're saying the is step one. They could stay there forever and know that they're saying but if they don't take that next step of inserting a pause, while it's uncomfortable and it's going to be awkward, but if they keep doing it, that becomes habitual, and eventually they don't even try to say anymore. That's just an example, but that repeats over and over. So what I'm going to do to walk through this is I'll focus on the first four areas of the seven performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, because that's where we get our agency. And they're interdependent. I was going to do them individually, like I did mental yesterday, but if I do them individually, you don't catch how they all work together. And physiology tends to be a big one. Now, I call it physical, and but it's actually both physical and physiology. So let's put that in perspective. On the physical side, make it simple, right? Because there's so much information. You don't need any information from me on fitness and nutrition and hydration. There's so much research out there. You just pick your source, and you're going to be right, because your body's going to adjust anyway. The body's very efficient at getting back to the homeostasis or the status quo. Your bigger work is learning to shift to make that transformation. But when you're judging physical, just consider that you can live seconds without blood, minutes without oxygen, days without water, weeks without food, and months or years without movement. So it tells you the order of what we should be paying attention to. And the first one being blood. So we want the blood thin, which means you have to hydrate. That way it can get the and the oxygen to the brain. Because if the blood can't get the nutrients and oxygen to the brain goes into pre-fight or flight stress response and starts stressing, right? And now you have I want the sympathetic nervous system kicking in. And when that happens, it can starve the other organs from nutrients. Now, you can look that up. You can figure out how you want to explain it for yourself. But the bottom line is you want to have hydration to keep the blood thin, nutrients and oxygen to the brain. Otherwise, you have downstream effects. The other thing you want is clean blood. So you want it thin and you want it clean. Well, oxygen cleans blood. When you do deep breathing, especially deep diaphragm type breathing, like they teach in martial arts, down into the lower abdomen, it's almost like people are walking around, especially in times of stress, breathing in the top third of their lungs. We want to breathe deep down into the lower belly and clean out all of that blood and cleanse the blood using breathing. The other thing you can do is movement, because movement gets the lymphatic fluid moving. The lymphatic fluid doesn't have a pump. And so what happens is if you're if if you don't have an active lifestyle, you have your lymph fluid not moving as much as it should be, and the lymphatic fluid is what moves out some of those toxins. So you want to do that. The other thing you can do is anti-inflammation, and one of the ways to get anti-inflammation is a certain kind of exercise, high intensity interval training. Now you may think that that's kind of like counterintuitive, but high intensity interval training, what it does is it triggers a human growth hormone type response. It creates more neurotransmitter, and one of the results of that is creating anti-inflammation. So you will have less inflammation, and as you get less inflammation, you get less oxidative waste. I can go on. We can talk about things like so back to the model: blood, oxygen. So deep breathing is important. We want to slow our breaths down. Do a box breathing, couple of box breathing sessions, and see what it feels like to have 4 breath cycles a minute, which is basically box breathing. 4 counts inhale, 4 counts hold, 4 counts exhale, 4 counts hold that. So that's 16 seconds. You do that 4 times, you have a minute. That's 4 breath cycles a minute. That's probably a little bit, could be a little bit strenuous because of it's short, but I spend 10 minutes in the morning doing 2 breath cycles. I do 15 seconds inhale, 15 seconds exhale. and then repeat that. And I do that for 10 minutes. The reason I do it is not so much for the oxygenation and health. There are benefits to that, but by going so long on the inhales and the exhales, I'm also creating some stress. So I balance that. And I wouldn't say a 15-second inhale or exhale is a anti-stress move, but it is a an anchoring move. So I do that for 10 minutes every morning. And through that, if I'm ever in this tough situation, all I have to do is take in an inhale and exhale for, I never have to exhale for 15 seconds during the day, but if I just exhale for 3 or 4 seconds, I'm already beyond that triggering pattern, and it gets interrupted. But I do recommend starting to look into some breathing. There's a great book, Just Breathe by Dan Brule. So many different exercises you can do. There's a 3, 4, 7, 8. There's the box breathing. Dan Brule talks about just 5 seconds. He says go 5 minutes in the morning, 5 seconds inhale, 5 seconds exhale. Simple. And you can work. That's where I started, and I worked my way to 15. I could go to 20, but as I said, it increases stress, and I'm not doing it for oxygenation. Anyway, do something for breathing. I don't want to tell you how to run your life, but if nothing else, start with box breathing. I really like box breathing while walking because you're walking and that's your count. 1, 2, 3, 4 on your steps. And so you just inhale for 4 steps, hold for 4 steps, exhale for 4 steps, hold that for 4 steps, inhale for 4 steps. And you could go to 6 steps if you want, or 5 steps. But if you walk for a half hour doing that, you will find that not only do you calm down, you're anchoring a reset. You're anchoring yourself to where you can automatically reset to that. So that's the breathing side. And then food, you know, food is interesting because there's so many different stories. I think I would say, being a baby boomer, that there's definitely shifts in what worked for me from a nutrient or eating standpoint in my 40s and then my 50s and then my 60s and then my 70s. And one of the things that I really like, I'm not saying this as a strategy. I'm saying for me though, for me, I really like the idea of reducing the carb intake down to less than 30 grams a day. That seems to be the one thing that makes a lot of sense, and that forces more protein and it forces more fats, and I'm doing that too, just to keep the blood sugar in check, because I do have diabetes in my family, and so that way I'm doing some prevention. So now we got the blood, we got the oxygen, and then the water is the hydration. If you get up in the morning, you feel like there's a little brain fog, just try this. And I'm not saying don't drink coffee, but there's another point about the coffee. But before you drink the coffee, you can always drink it after. See if you could drink a liter of water. That's a quart. See if you could drink a quart of water. If not a quart, then drink a half a liter of water, and do that right away. So I do that, and then I do my breathing, and I could drink coffee before or after. But by hydrating, what you'll find is it doesn't take hours. It takes sometimes seconds, but usually just a minute, two, three. You can already feel the brain fog lifting. Why? Because you've been dehydrated. The blood is thick. It's not getting to the brain. When you first start drinking water, the hydration starts immediately. The brain gets nutrients, it gets the oxygen, and it starts waking up. Now, you're going to wake up anyway, right? But you wake up faster. And you'll see that the water does what you were hoping the coffee would do. Now, you can still drink the coffee. On the coffee note, I drink coffee. I love espresso. I probably overdo it, but I pick your vice, right? I pick the vice that's going to have the least adverse effect. I don't want to get into a debate about that because there's other things I could do that are much worse. But when middle of my career, I had a role where I had just come out of the field and I was in home office, and my role was to go and meet with this is a 50,000 person company, to go and meet with all the different departments and do these presentations. And I had been teaching public speaking, so I was pretty good at it, and I knew how to be a little entertaining when I'm speaking, and I would put a lot of preparation into it. And so I kept getting invited back to speak, and I would speak to like layers and layers. I'd speak to the leaders, and then they'd want to have me speak to the teams, and it was pretty cool. And one of the things that I noticed is that, because these are people I didn't know. I'm new in home office, like, and so it was easy for me to get questions that I didn't have answers to. And this is many years ago, right? But I would feel that tension come up. My solution was to not drink coffee before those presentations. So if it, I don't care what time the presentation was, I would not drink coffee before that presentation, because what I observed, this is just real time observation, just paying attention, wanting to improve my speaking or wanting to improve the outcome. I would notice that if I drank caffeine or coffee, that a simple question could trigger that feeling, and you all know what that feeling is when it comes up, and then you get that tension. And fortunately, I had some skills. I had been a practitioner of NLP, certified there, so I was able to do some things to reset. But it's like, why go through that? Why, if I don't drink the caffeine, then I don't get that triggering. Turns out that that's the precursor to the fight or flight, and those are some of the inputs that I use to understand how all this stuff works. So blood is blood, breathing, water is what I would say about the physical. And that was a way of a kind of a roundabout way of saying that I'm going to focus on the 7 fitness areas, and those 7 fitness areas, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and then are the 4 that I'll be focusing on. And the next ones are, where to go, where to go. So all of them are right. What's going on? This is interesting. Oh, there we go. So there's the first 4 we'll be focusing on: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. Relationships, professional, that requires involvement with other people. And then financial outcome, obviously, is going to involve some other people at some level. While this is the main part for agency, I will tell you, in working with people, I recognize that once they get agency in a stable, controlled environment, which is where we get this, which is why I'm going to be focusing on these 4 for the next couple of weeks. Once we introduce this, especially if they're going after a quest that's difficult or scary, this can trigger things from the past. That's why I put in that 4th pillar of forgiveness, to make sure you forgive yourself and forgive others, so there's less buttons that are available to be pushed. But we're going to focus just on these 3. And as I said, in each one, there's a big aha that I want to make sure we get. That people have to see that there's a mind versus neurons. I want them to understand neuroplasticity. So my physical is really physiology. It's much more than just physical. That part about physical that I just said with the blood, oxygen, and hydration, that's about as much as I'm going to say about it. The big point is the physiology, neuroplasticity, and how it impacts our day to day. Then consciousness would be the spiritual. This is awareness of awareness. It's not about the spiritual realm. And then we have self regulation, which includes the modulation. So remember, the modulation is inside the regulation. Modulation is a smaller part. And when you modulate, you don't have to regulate because the part is already done. If you don't modulate, now the emotion is like a uh, neurobiological event, and it's going to take more work. To make this make sense, what I do is, let's see. we'll go we'll look at where I start. I always like to start with purpose. What is the person's purpose? Now, a couple of days ago, I talked about a few questions. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail, right? We want to come out with a purpose. The way this works is, let's imagine you have a circle, and that's you in the middle of the circle. 360 degrees is a circle. So this over here would be 90 degrees, and this over here would be 90 degrees. And that's assuming that your direction of travel is this way. So that's your direction of travel. If you think of this like a clock face, 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock would be 90 degrees. If you're moving along on a bicycle or a motorcycle or a car, you're moving along at a decent pace. You can see that to make a 90-degree turn is going to take some effort. You're going to have to slow down, slow your speed enough to make that turn, and of course it depends on how big the turn is. But if it's a quick turn that you have to make 90 degrees, like in a city street, you're going to have to slow down quite a bit to make that turn, and then you have to accelerate again. It takes up a lot of energy. If you were to go a little bit less, like a 60-degree turn, you can see that's going to take a little bit less energy to slow down and then start up again. And then if you do a 30-degree turn, it takes even less energy, because if you're moving along, you can just make a nice little edge. So if you're on a bicycle, this is easy to visualize. On a bicycle, you could very easily pivot 30 degrees and you'll be okay. Now, the challenge is as you get further and further out, that 30 degrees can get very, very wide. So you reset it. Now, what is this talking about? If you look at, and again, this is like a clock face. So you have 3, 2, and 1. And on this side, 11, 10, and 9. Once you have your purpose, and you allow yourself that from wherever you are, like I said, you reset it. So when you're here, you're going to reset it. And what is this reset? What I'm suggesting, to be able to pivot, and if you pivot early enough, you don't have to make these 90-degree turns. If you wait too long to adjust, you're more likely going to have to make a bigger turn. And what we don't want to do is a complete reversal. You would rather pivot your way through life like a plane going to from California to New York, where it's off course most of the time. You rather pivot your way through life rather than go, 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 and then make these major, major shifts. So you want to get good at pivoting, and these are more incremental, whereas this becomes more transformational. So you have to learn how to do transformation, but that enables you to do pivots easily. So what are these two lines? Well, one way to think about it is, if I put passion on this side and purpose on this side, I now have a set of parameters. And as long as I'm inside these parameters, I'm still directionally good with my purpose. And I would say that while passion is important, it's not enough. Passion is not enough to go through the tough times. Passion is not enough to go through the valleys. You want to have purpose, and purpose will get you through. See, people won't crawl over broken glass for their passion, but they'll crawl over broken glass for their purpose. So you want to have both. And I would say, I would recommend, because I've done it both ways, I would recommend having your purpose, and you're never going to lock it in exactly, but get directional. Lock in on your purpose, and you can refine it as you go and find your passion within the purpose. I spent years trying to focus on my passion and find the purpose within that. It just makes it a lot harder. And by the way I have this drawn, it's actually your pivot is all the way across. I don't mean to say you're only going to, purpose is only on one side and passion is on the other. The whole thing, these are just boundaries. You're going to pivot between your passion and your purpose. So what does that mean? That means all of this, for the most part, is out of scope. The reason this is important is because if you look at your day and you think about how you prioritize, unless you've done some training, thought through this, you've seen some models, maybe read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, it's very easy for people to get tripped up and respond to urgency and think it's important. If the phone rings, you don't know whether or not it's important until you look at who's calling, and you still don't know if it's important until you pick it up. If you're a parent, you know the feeling, right? One of your children call you at a time that's not usual, and your heart may do a little bump, right? Because, okay, what is this about? You don't know. And if you're like most parents, most of the time it's okay, but still you still get that little. So we want to make sure that we're separating the two. Now I'm kind of getting into where I'm going with this, and it's about managing the habit patterns that come up. So before I go into that, we're going to take a look at, I like using two axis tension diagrams. So on this side, we'll have impact, and on this side, we'll have urgency. And if you recognize this as the Eisenhower matrix, and when the impact is high and the urgency is high, to do the diagram right, he has high over here, high urgency over here, low over here. Then this quadrant he calls it quadrant one because it's urgent and high impact. This would be quadrant two, low urgency but high impact. And then you have uh, three and four, of 3 and 4. So three is high urgency but low impact, and 4 would be low urgency and low impact. And it's actually not impact, it's importance. But the way I get to impact is I say, the way I define important is important. What I'm going to do is look at what is the adverse impact. And if the adverse impact is small, then it's probably not important. And then there could be a timeline associated with that. If the adverse impact is high, and you'll find your own way of measuring that, but you get the idea. I'm just sharing this as a model. This is something I would go to right away. As soon as you start feeling stress, you say, okay, wait a minute, what's the impact? What's the urgency? Or you can say what's important, what's the urgency, but impact is just a direct way of doing it. What's the adverse impact? And what that'll do is it'll slow things down. Similarly, I say effective first, then efficient. Okay? Always effective first and then efficient. Now, once you're in an operational environment, it switches. You're going to be efficient and then thinking about effectiveness. You're doing project work. When you're doing project work, it's all about effectiveness. This is why there's such a disconnect when you put strong operational people in charge of a project. They don't really think about effectiveness first. They're thinking about efficiency, get the thing back online. So effective first, then efficiency. Important is adverse impact. And you, by doing this matrix right away in your mind, you can start getting some space between stimuli and how you're feeling. So that's what this whole page is about. Once you have your purpose, you also, and by the way, in finding your purpose, you want to ask why. 7 times because you want to get that deep. You want that purpose so deep. And when you know that, you know what to say no to. You're just not going to do some things. You once you know what you're going to say no to, it helps inform your importance versus urgent. Now, this is where I want to tell you why I'm going through this. Let's see. And this is illustrating a stimulus response cycle. It's from my 7-step reset. So you have steps 1, 2, and then step 3 is the conditioned reaction. So I'm only going to focus on that right now. And then steps 4 through 7. I'm not going to go too deep in here because it's on the website 7stepreset.com/live. But this conditioned reaction, this happens thousands of times a day. We have every other second, potentially, we're having another stimulus response cycle. It's just the way it is. 95% of what we do is done by habit. So most of these are habitual. They're just running, which is why our yesterdays look just like our tomorrows and on and on. But this is how it's normally going. And illustrative, of course. And this return to presence or mindfulness gets us ready for this next one. So on a good day, things are going well. This is calm. Everything's going fine. Your day is normal. This is not transformation. Transformation is not going to feel normal, but you get the picture. Then, when you get into a stress situation, it collapses. First, it collapses horizontally. I'm sorry, it collapses horizontally where your conditioned reaction is not based on what's coming externally, it's based on internal sensations. And this is where people spiral. So once this is happening, this is full trigger, this is fight or flight, you're not getting any daylight between one stimulus reaction and the next stimulus reaction. I use the word reaction when I'm inside the habit model. I use the word response when the conscious mind comes online afterwards, just for clarity. But this collapsing when it's boom, 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 you're out of this. You are no longer in control, and this is where people feel the need to try to suppress this. They try to stop it, and if it's not a tiger, a real tiger or tiger level threat that's imminent, like within seconds, is going to kill you, stopping it is not useful. What you wanted, suppressing it or stopping it on this side is not useful. What you can do is just delay it. And this is where the techniques come in to start slowing things down. So when you feel that first thing come up, that's the modulation. If you don't catch it then, now you're along for the ride. It's a lot harder to catch it later. So you can't wait. You can't count to 10. You can't, wait for confirmation that you're starting to get. When you first feel that come up, take a deep breath in, and it only needs to be 1 to 3 seconds, but a slow exhale. And that slow exhale triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, which is coming back online and slowing things down. And if these stimulus response cycles are happening in 1 second, you've already used up 1 or 2 seconds breathing in, and now you're exhaling for 5 or 6 seconds. That's 6 or 7 seconds of delay before you have this next conditioned reaction. Now, we're talking about physiology. You may want to do something else like stand up, or maybe walk around, or walk over to a window, or lean back in your chair, or draw a diagram. I sometimes, if I'm feeling like, okay, this is conversation's not going well, I'll just draw that 2-axis diagram, and it's, very quickly, I'll just jump in and very quickly, I'll just jump in and do what is it? What were we talking about? We're talking about results, and we're talking about how you get those results. Just by separating it, it's like a convergence divergence. So that's very, very useful. Another one might be profit, revenue, or growth, profit, whatever. Just I very quickly will do these, just whatever comes up. I just draw it, and then it creates context for conversation because it slows everything down, and I'm no longer focusing on what's coming from inside. So once this is coming from the inside, you're no longer responding to the real threat. You're responding to your own inner sensations. And if you're already like this, if you're already tense, and if you're already like this, you're already tense, your breathing is shallow, your jaw is clenched, you can see that your internal sensations are still fight or flight. And the brain, it interpreted the initial threat as a tiger level, which is why you're in this fight or flight. And then it's looking for the tiger. And when it doesn't find a tiger, it doesn't stop there. It's assuming there's some threat. And you've seen people justify their actions, but it's looking for a threat. And what it's finding is you're tensed up, you're shallow breathing, your jaw is clenched, you're looking left and right, you're narrowing your field of focus. All of these things are telling it, yes, the threat is still present. The threat is still present. Where is it? And while it's looking, it's just cycling through. This is what happens when a person is fighting against themselves. They engage their willpower, and then the I don't want power comes up, and they start fighting against, and it's all internal. There is no external threat. They're just fighting against themselves. So let's look at this as how it actually looks in the 1 second model. And by the way, as I go back and forth through the 7 performance areas and the 1 second model, I'm literally doing a convergence at the 1 second model and a divergence at the 7 performance areas, just by going up and down. So if I'm starting to not like what's going on right now, I may go out, frame out, right? Open up my field of vision to where and I'm looking, where am I in this model? Am I, is what's my emotional doing? What's the issue here? What's my physiology like? That's like step two, the check in the dashboard. But let's go to this slide right here. So this is the 1 second model. Then it's roughly, usually it's like less than a second, but it sounds better to just say 1 second model. There's a pre-listening part before the stimulus. The stimulus happens here. There's a pre-listening. Then there's initial detection, a rapid appraisal, reaction, formation, and then you have the pre-conscious surfacing. So this line right here, this space, that's where the network of neurons begins to hand off to the conscious mind. It takes that millions of bits of information that it's been processing around threat, and it gets it to a place, to a thing that's perceived by the conscious mind. So it takes all that energy that's going through the network of neurons, it turns it into a thought, converts it to a thought that's can be perceived by the conscious mind, and then that's where you have your leading to the response. There's a few things that happen in the conscious mind, and then you make your response. And this is why I say don't let your response equal your reaction, because you're probably going to get it wrong, especially in times of change. When I started looking at cognitive biases, because that was the first area I looked at to gain prevention, and I had 3 dozen cognitive biases that were often it had an adverse impact on high performance environments. Turns out that this initial detection is where the cognitive biases come in. So rather than focus on all the cognitive biases, we're going to manage the pre listening. We'll manage the pre listening to where it's not assuming everything is a threat, and it's not even paying attention to everything. Because remember the circle with the out of scope? Some things are just out of scope. And so we're going to program the subconscious or the network of neurons that stuff is out of scope. Yeah, you'll notice it, you'll pay attention to it, but you're not passing it along. And those cognitive biases, you're not going to be able to stop them, But what we do over here is after the preconscious surfacing and the conscious mind comes online, what we're going to do there is discount this reaction until we get more information rather than letting the reaction just come straight across full strength and turn into a response. Because again, we're not fighting a tiger, we're dealing with an email. So we don't need a full strength, full on reaction into our response. We're going to discount it and see what's going on first. We're going to spend some time circling. And when I say spend time, I'm talking about a half second. Because remember, this is happening in a half second, and then you have another half second before you respond. A half second, you're going to process enough information, especially as you program the network of neurons, et cetera. So now we are in a place where we are getting back in control. When this doesn't happen, you get this. This is what I was saying, it collapses. So if this is normal times, then what happens when it collapses, you can see the conscious side starts to collapse. And then down here, when you're really triggered, the initial detection and the rapid appraisal collapse. And as these collapse, you're no longer looking externally for a stimulus, you're looking internally, and our internal sensations are all about fear. Now I'm just going to come out of this for a moment. So to bring this and make it more realistic or more practical, in the US there's a lot going on. So they talk about flooding the zone, and there's so much information every day. There's creators out there with breaking news every few minutes, not every few minutes, but certainly two or three times in the morning, two or three times in the afternoon, breaking news. And most of the news headlines, most of the news is bad news. There's very little good news that comes out of these breaking news. I'm not knocking the creators, but there's one particular creator that I want to highlight. And this person has been doing political stuff for decades. She's been highly involved. She gets it. She's a history person buff. She understands history. She can tell you that this happened in this presidential time and this one and blah blah blah. And she can tell you how things are repeating. And what's interesting is I don't want to call her out, but she looks exhausted sometimes. But she's not exhausted because of the flooding the zone. She's exhausted because her followers are doing that stacking thing. They are, every time something comes up, they go back inside and they're looking for all this thing. They're coming up with all these crazy outcomes that might happen. And she's explaining to them, no, it's not that. And she used this terminology. She called it the doom goalposts. She said the doom goalposts keep moving. And that's what it feels like. This is why you want to get a handle on this, because the doom, yes, there's some bad news coming in, but that triggering that fight or flight that people are seeing constantly, a big portion of it is coming from inside, and that's part of the strategy. If the let's say the worst case scenario is that there is some bad actor in some foreign country pulling the strings in the US, and the US is responding to that, and so they're kind of controlled because there's pictures and files that would incriminate them, and so they're basically blackmailed into doing these things that are really ugly and horrific. Let's say that's the worst, that let's say that's real. And if you're this big actor up here doing it, this is not your first rodeo. You know how to do this stuff. And what you're going to do is you're not going to come up with some willy-nilly plan. You're going to do what works. You're going to use processes that are proven to work. And what's proven to work is the 1 second model keeps repeating over and over and over. And if you can inject enough fear and triggering, you're going to have people repeating this over and over. And now you can control them because they are consumed and they're looking for what's the next thing. They're looking for meaning. They're always looking for meaning. And you can just pop meaning out there. And then you throw some bots in there to keep the anxiety up. And next thing you know, you have people stressed out all the time. And this creator I'm talking about is exhausted from trying to pull her followers back off the ledge, explaining to them that this is what happens in these kinds of times, and it's important to keep your agency. That's why I go back to the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional are the 4. And then as we get externally, we have to reset that again, because agency that works on a good day of a good week is not enough for a bad day of a bad week. And as you bring in other things like the relationship and professional, it gets harder. So I want you to think about this in the context of my day to day. How am I responding? And then going back to this picture, recognizing that you have to make a choice here. But most people don't even realize that it's the network of neurons with the associations running the show, and that they are handing off. The network of neurons is handing off to the conscious mind a representation of what it has seen. And as adults, it's pretty hard for us to go back. It's pretty hard for us to go back and change this. This is happening at rocket speed, and over here much slower. And by the time you do anything, it's already off and running, and it's recruiting, so to speak, other neural pathways, which is why you get this spiraling effect. It's like, this is really scary. Come on, help me find the danger. Help me find the threat. And you're bringing others on, and I say all you have to do. It is simply that easy. Get up, do something physiological, because if you do something physiological, especially something that moves your awareness out, because as you're doing this, you're converging and your options are being reduced. And what you want to do is push that out, literally, like look out, look around. And one of the easiest ways to do it is go to a window if you can and look out the window. And it's huge, everything's out there, right? You just look around, and it only takes seconds because this is processing so fast. It's processing at 11 million bits per second. When you go to the window and you look outside and 2 or 3 seconds pass, that's a lot of information that's been processed. And the subconscious is now like, where's the threat? There's not a threat. It slows it down. That's the step 2 of the 7-step reset, is to return to presence and be ready so that your pre-listening is appropriate. We don't want to be pre-listening for every single thing. We want to be pre-listening for what's important to us. And the second thing you can do, especially in times of flooding the zone, is discount what's coming from this reaction. You can discount it over here in the conscious mind. When I say discount, yeah, it's only a 20% wait until I understand. Remember, it's urgent. The network of neurons is focused on urgency and efficiency. And so that's going to feel like it's important. That's why I do the diagrams. Just draw the diagram, effectiveness and efficiency. What do these look like? And you're not going to go like all the way to the end on efficiency or all the way to the end on effectiveness. That's why I like the 2-axis model, because it's a give and take and push and pull. And what those models do is they show that there's a tension there and you have to balance both. So that's a making it more practical using the 7 performance areas. And if I look at it from the 7 performance areas lens, here's what I see. There's a mental component. You have to know what's going on. That's why I do talk about some of the theory and how the brain works. So you have to know what's going on so you can pinpoint it. The physical gets to the physiology. Remember, I talked about more about physiology. This is where we interrupt the pattern. The easiest way to interrupt the pattern is a physical movement and breathing. A shallow inhale and a long exhale. Another thing you can do is walk through a doorway, because as soon as you walk through a doorway, the network of neurons is looking around to see what's going on, what changed, what's threats. It takes you off that other one because it couldn't find the threat anyway. So what you're going to do is give it a new place to look, and now that moment that you get is giving you an opportunity to walk through the door of peace. And you walking through the door looks like dropping your shoulders. It looks like, so, yeah, it looks like dropping your shoulders, unclenching your jaw, smiling, looking up and looking around, looking wider, breathing slower, slowing down your breathing, put a smile on your face. That's walking through the door. Interrupting the pattern is step 1, and you can do that if you catch it early. And I'm talking about in a second. As soon as you feel it come up, you look around, drop your shoulders, take a breath, smile, and that's walking through the door. And then you have to focus on what's really important. That's where you go back to your purpose and your passion. What's really important now, and start looking at that. Now, this is not a hack. It's not a quick one, two, three, and I would do it. It's, you have to train yourself. It's a habit that you're going through in order to get there. You have to train yourself, and that's going through the door. But the training can be done in weeks, it's not months, but you have to do it. It's just like when you're conditioning a dog to do a certain thing or a pet to do a certain thing. It takes some repetition, but then they get it. And that's what you're going to do. You're going to do some repetition, and it'll come. Tomorrow I'll talk about a major, and all of this is prevention. Why is it prevention? Because we're catching it so early. If you don't catch it early, the emotional part spirals out, and you end up with a neurobiological event, and you have the heart racing and all this stuff. You get the adrenaline, you get the cortisol going through your body, and the constant threat assessment. And this could have been avoided if you could catch the emotion shift in the first 90 seconds. That's emotional modulation. We'll get into that probably next week. The spiritual part of it is the awareness of awareness. You want to be aware. But it's not just being aware. You have to be aware that, okay, I'm relaxed. I see what's going on. But then I you have to be aware, am I doing the next step? Am I walking through the door, the proverbial door? Of am I doing the thing? Am I taking my attention off of that? Sometimes people, they can modulate their emotion, they do the physiology thing and they change. And then instead of what I say, going through the door or doing the action, they keep looking for the threat. They go back and say, yeah, but what about this? And they're focusing on the threat, and it brings the whole thing up again. You have to move on. Remember the picture that we made of out of scope. That's why I spent the time on this diagram in the beginning, because this is out of scope. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to ignore it completely, but it's not important. It has a low importance, and it may have high urgency, but urgent for who? So you gotta use these models, these frameworks. If it's out of scope, it's out of scope. This is why it's so important to have your purpose and passion figured out, and that becomes your area of focus. That's what you pivot into. And if you do get outside of something, there's another thing you can do is you can look at circle of influence versus circle of concern. So concern, and this is out of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and influence. So if you are stressed out, your circle of influence gets smaller because you're closing in and you have fewer options, and your circle of concern takes on more control. When you're staying in agency and showing up with presence, your circle of influence gets larger and larger because you're always focusing on what you can do. That's why I say you have to go back to what's out of scope so you focus on what you have to do. I'll pick this up tomorrow and go and continue, because there's a lot of things, there's a lot coming out now. You got global activity going on. There's 5 wars according to Ray Dalio and his Changing World Order: capital wars, technology wars, trade wars, geopolitical wars, and then military wars. And we have at least 4 out of the 5 going on, depending on what country you're in. So it's naturally a lot of turmoil going on. But what you can do, and all you can do, is enough. But you have to be focused.